He strutted into the courtroom certain of his brilliance, but what began as a routine trial would end with a revelation so shocking it left the entire gallery in stunned silence. The cameras zoomed tighter. The governor's practiced composure faltered, her eyes darting for footing that wasn't there. Her shoulders stiffened as the weight of the question settled. Cooper's eyes flicked between them, sensing the clash had tipped from debate to exposure. Viewers could feel it. Sanders wasn't answering a question. She was being cornered, boxed in by the Constitution itself. Every second she hesitated deepened the silence, sharpened the tension. Crockett didn't blink. She knew the fatal error had been made, the trap was sprung, and the whole world was watching. Sanders' throat tightened as she forced a response, her voice suddenly thinner than it had been minutes earlier. "Our legal team reviewed that legislation thoroughly," she said, clinging to the words like a lifeline. But the audience could hear it. There was no conviction, no steel behind the claim. Crockett's brow arched, her expression cool, almost surgical. "Did they?" she asked, letting the question cut through the air. She lifted her phone, scrolling with deliberate calm. Because any first-year law student could spot the violations in Arkansas Act 1002. Section 3 directly contradicts the Civil Rights Act. Section 7 undermines the Voting Rights Act. Section 12? It ignores binding Supreme Court precedent. "Governor, that's not sovereignty. That's a constitutional train wreck." Sanders opened her mouth, but the words tumbled weakly. Arkansas has the right." That's when Crockett struck. She leaned in, her voice steady, unflinching, and sharp enough to slice through steel. "Governor Sanders, you don't know the law." The studio went dead silent. Cooper froze mid-breath. The governor's face drained of color, the confidence that had carried her into the studio, now shattered into fragments. At that instant, everyone watching understood. Sanders wasn't debating anymore. She was unraveling, live, on national television. For a moment, the studio was a cathedral of silence. Sanders sat frozen, her lips parted but unable to summon words. The governor, who once sparred daily with the White House press corps, now looked like a defendant who had just realized the jury had turned against her. Anderson Cooper glanced between the two women, his instincts screaming that he had just witnessed something extraordinary. Millions of viewers at home leaned closer to their screens, aware they were watching not a debate, but a collapse. The dam burst within minutes. On Twitter, the clip of Crockett's line, "Governor Sanders, you don't know the law," spread like wildfire. Hashtags trended globally. Legal scholars who rarely entered political squabbles weighed in, praising the precision of Crockett's dismantling. Even conservative commentators struggled to defend Sanders, their silence more damning than any attack. But the true shock came days later. Freedom of Information Act requests revealed internal Arkansas memos. Legal advisors had warned Sanders her legislation wouldn't survive federal scrutiny. She knew the risks. She ignored them. Crockett's takedown wasn't just humiliation. It was proof of willful negligence. In that CNN studio, Crockett ascended from rising congresswoman to constitutional sentinel. Sanders, once whispered as presidential timber, was left standing in ruins, her credibility shattered under the brightest lights in America. The hum of the courthouse carried with it a strange tension, a blend of whispered strategy, clicking pens, and the heavy footsteps of officers lining the marble halls. Ethan Marshall moved through it like he owned the space, shoulders squared, chin lifted, every detail of his presence rehearsed for maximum effect. Reporters recognized him immediately, their cameras flashing as if he were a celebrity rather than an attorney. Ethan basked in it, flashing that meticulously polished smile, giving them a headline-worthy soundbite. "This case is about facts, not feelings. We'll see soon enough who has both." He knew the reporters would run with it. They always did. His arrogance wasn't a flaw in his mind, it was branding. But the moment he stepped into the courtroom, something shifted. The air grew heavier, the chatter more subdued. At the plaintiff's table sat a woman Ethan had dismissed as irrelevant, hardly worth remembering. Eleanor Washington. She sat perfectly still, her navy suit plain, her silver hair pinned back neatly, her worn leather briefcase resting at her side. Her hands folded calmly on the table, as though she had all the time in the world. Ethan almost laughed. This was the opposition? A relic clinging to some half-faded glory? He had prepared for theatrics, for activists shouting slogans, for passionate young lawyers with fire but no precision. Instead, he found silence. And silence, though he would never admit it, unsettled him. He leaned over to his paralegal and muttered just loud enough for the nearest reporters to hear, "Should we get her a map to find the courtroom?" hate for her to get lost on the way to irrelevance. The reporters chuckled, their pens scratching furiously, while a few jurors exchanged glances that Ethan didn't notice. Eleanor did not flinch. She turned her head slowly, meeting Ethan's mocking gaze with eyes that carried the weight of decades. They were not angry eyes, nor were they fragile. They were steady, ancient in their patience, the kind of eyes that had watched empires of arrogance crumble. Four. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, not of amusement, but of recognition, as though she had seen men like Ethan rise and fall so many times that his particular brand of hubris hardly required acknowledgement. That smile disarmed more people than Ethan realized. The jurors shifted again, this time toward her. Even Judge Whitman, seated above in his black robes, tilted his head slightly at the sight of her. He said nothing, but his eyes lingered on Eleanor longer than protocol required. Ethan mistook it for pity. As the bailiff called the court to order, Ethan strutted toward his table, pausing deliberately to let his voice carry. "Let's get this done quickly, shall we? No need to drag out what everyone already knows." The words echoed across the chamber, arrogance dripping like venom. But there was a faint ripple through the crowd, a murmur that suggested not everyone shared his certainty. Eleanor, still silent, opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of carefully organized files. Her fingers brushed over them with reverence, like a pastor handling scripture. She didn't look at Ethan again, and that stung more than any cutting remark could have. To her, he wasn't even worth the energy of a response. And that, though Ethan didn't yet grasp it, was the beginning of his unraveling. From his bench, Judge Whitman watched with a subtle tightening of his jaw. He knew that expression on Eleanor's face. It had been 3 decades since he'd last seen it, but he remembered. The calm before she dismantled an empire. Ethan, blind in his vanity, leaned back in his chair, smirk widening, convinced the trial was already his. He did not see that the real battle had already begun, quietly, invisibly, between his arrogance and her unshakable dignity. And in that silent contest, the courtroom was already choosing sides. The hum of the courthouse carried with it a strange tension, a blend of whispered strategy, clicking pens, and the heavy footsteps of officers lining the marble halls. Ethan Marshall moved through it like he owned the space, shoulders squared, chin lifted, every detail of his presence rehearsed for maximum effect. Reporters recognized him immediately, their cameras flashing as if he were a celebrity rather than an attorney. Ethan basked in it, flashing that meticulously polished smile, giving them a headline-worthy soundbite. "This case is about facts, not feelings. We'll see soon enough who has both." He knew the reporters would run with it. They always did. His arrogance wasn't a flaw in his mind, it was branding. But the moment he stepped into the courtroom, something shifted. The air grew heavier, the chatter more subdued. At the plaintiff's table sat a woman Ethan had dismissed as irrelevant, hardly worth remembering. Eleanor Washington. She sat perfectly still, her navy suit plain, her silver hair pinned back neatly, her worn leather briefcase resting at her side, her hands folded calmly on the table, as though she had all the time in the world. Ethan almost laughed. This was the opposition, a relic clinging to some half-faded glory. He had prepared for theatrics, for activists shouting slogans, for passionate young lawyers with fire but no precision. Instead, he found silence, and silence, though he would never admit it, unsettled him. He leaned over to his paralegal and muttered just loud enough for the nearest reporters to hear, "Should we get her a map to find the COO? Courtroom? Hate for her to get lost on the way to irrelevance." The reporters chuckled, their pens scratching furiously, while a few jurors exchanged glances that Ethan didn't notice. Eleanor did not flinch. She turned her head slowly, meeting Ethan's mocking gaze with eyes that carried the weight of decades. They were not angry eyes, nor were they fragile. They were steady, ancient in their patience, the kind of eyes that had watched empires of arrogance crumble before. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, not of amusement, but of recognition, as though she had seen men like Ethan rise and fall so many times that his particular brand of hubris hardly required acknowledgement. That smile disarmed more people than Ethan realized. The jurors shifted again, this time toward her. Even Judge Whitman, seated above in his black robes, tilted his head slightly at the sight of her. He said nothing, but his eyes lingered on Eleanor longer than protocol required. Ethan mistook it for pity. As the bailiff called the court to order, Ethan strutted toward his table, pausing deliberately to let his voice carry. "Let's get this done quickly, shall we? No need to drag out what everyone already knows." The words echoed across the chamber, arrogance dripping like venom, but there was a faint ripple through the crowd, a murmur that suggested not everyone shared his certainty. Eleanor, still silent, opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of carefully organized files. Her fingers brushed over them with reverence like a pastor handling scripture. She didn't look at Ethan again, and that stung more than any cutting remark could have. To her, he wasn't even worth the energy of a response. And that, though Ethan didn't yet grasp it, was the beginning of his unraveling. From his bench, Judge Whitman watched with a subtle tightening of his jaw. He knew that expression on Eleanor's face. It had been 3 decades since he'd last seen it, but he remembered. The calm before she dismantled an empire. Ethan, blind in his vanity, leaned back in his chair, smirk widening, convinced the trial was already his. He did not see that the real battle had already begun, quietly, invisibly, between his arrogance and her unshakable dignity. And in that silent contest, the courtroom was already choosing sides. The courthouse was never truly silent. Even when the judge's gavel stilled the room, there lingered the soft rustle of papers, the scrape of a chair against the floor, the hushed whispers of reporters scratching down every word. But in the hours after opening statements, the air inside felt charged, heavy, like a storm rolling in that no one could stop. The first witnesses were called, and suddenly the courtroom became a crucible, one where Ethan Marshall's arrogance began to clash against something far older, steadier, and infinitely more dangerous: Eleanor Washington's patience. The first to the stand was a young man who claimed to have seen the arrest from across the street. His voice shook as he recounted what he'd seen, his eyes darting toward the officers sitting in the gallery, their presence like a wall of intimidation. Ethan rose for cross-examination, his suit gleaming, his voice slick with false warmth. "You say you saw the entire event, correct?" The witness nodded nervously. "From how far away?" Ethan pressed, stepping closer with predatory precision. "Maybe 50 feet. Ethan smirked, letting the jury catch it. 50 feet. Through traffic, in the dark? And you're sure, absolutely sure you saw everything clearly?" His tone was honey, but the poison underneath dripped into every syllable. The witness faltered, fumbling over his words, and then pounced. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let's be reasonable. At 50 feet, in poor lighting, even Superman wouldn't have a clear view. This testimony isn't reliable." The gallery stirred with murmurs. Some jurors shifted uneasily. Ethan strutted back to his table, triumphant. But Eleanor didn't rise immediately. She waited long enough for the silence to stretch until even Ethan glanced at her, confused. Finally she stood, smoothing the front of her modest suit, and approached the stand. Her voice when she spoke was calm as still water. 50 feet, she said softly. "That's about the distance from this witness box to the back wall of this courtroom, correct?" The witness nodded. Eleanor turned, gesturing gently. "Would you mind pointing to the clock above the door for us?" The young man obeyed, steady this time, his hand lifting without hesitation. "Could you also tell us what time it shows?" Eleanor asked. 10:31. "And what color is the tie of the gentleman in the third row, far left?" "Red." Eleanor paused, her eyes sweeping toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, 50 feet is not far at all when the truth is in plain sight." The jury murmured now for a different reason. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his smirk gone, his fingers tightening around his pen. He opened his mouth as if to object but snapped it shut again, realizing the damage had already been done. The day continued with more witnesses. Each time, Ethan lunged like a wolf, tearing into their credibility with sarcasm and technicalities. Each time, Eleanor rebuilt their dignity with quiet questions that illuminated truth. Where Ethan used volume, she used weight. Where he used performance, she used presence. Slowly, the balance began to tilt. The tension between them grew more palpable with every exchange. Ethan's voice grew sharper, his patience shorter. The gallery rippled with whispers. Ethan sat, his jaw clenched, his ears burning. For the first time, he felt something gnawing at the edges of his confidence. Not fear exactly, but the uncomfortable realization that his usual weapons weren't working. Eleanor noticed. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply pressed forward, her calm demeanor radiating something Ethan could not understand, something that unsettled him more than open defiance ever could. It was the composure of someone who had faced down worse than arrogance. By the time the judge recessed for lunch, Ethan was rattled. He left the courtroom quickly, avoiding reporters, his polished shoes clicking faster than usual. Behind him, Eleanor walked slowly, her hand resting lightly on Margaret Wallace's shoulder as they left together. Her stride was unhurried, her expression calm. She looked like someone in control of the storm. And Ethan, despite all his bravado, looked like a man just beginning to realize the storm wasn't his to command. The afternoon light slanted through the courthouse windows, painting long bars of gold across the polished wooden floor. The jury filed back in, their faces neutral but their eyes weary. They had been listening all day, watching the tug of war between a young lion drunk on arrogance and a seasoned warrior who fought not with force but with quiet conviction. As the bailiff called the court to order, the air seemed thicker than it had been that morning, as if everyone could sense that something was about to crack. Ethan Marshall leaned forward at the defense table, his jaw tight, his confidence fraying at the edges. The headlines he had pictured earlier that morning were fading in his mind, replaced with flashes of Eleanor Washington's calm, unshakable presence. Every time he tried to crush a witness, she had rebuilt them. Every time he sneered, she answered with dignity. He Cohen. Udden admit it, not to his colleagues, not to the reporters scribbling in the gallery, not even to himself, but he was slipping. The jury was slipping. And worse, he could feel the judge's eyes on him like a weight he couldn't shake. So Ethan did what cornered men often do. He lashed out. When Eleanor rose to present a new witness, Ethan cut across her, his voice sharp, dripping venom. Your Honor, I must object. Counsel is clearly dragging this case out with theatrics that don't belong in a courtroom. With all due respect, she's past her prime. This case deserves clarity, not fortune cookie wisdom from someone who should have retired decades ago. The courtroom gasped. Reporters' pens froze mid-scratch. Jurors exchanged glances, some in open disbelief. Even the police officers sitting in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor, still standing, did not move. She simply turned her head toward Ethan, her expression utterly serene, her silver hair catching the sunlight like a crown. She didn't flinch. She didn't fire back. She didn't need to. It was Judge Whitman who spoke, his gavel cracking down once, sharp as a gunshot. Mr. Marshall? His voice was steady but cold. Watch your tone. Ethan froze, but the damage was done. His words hung in the air like smoke, staining the room with arrogance so thick no one could ignore it. Eleanor turned back to the jury, her voice softer than a whisper, yet clear enough for all to hear. The law is not about who speaks the loudest, she said. It is about who speaks the truth. She didn't look at Ethan again. She didn't have to. The jury's eyes had already left him. They were on her. The witness, a middle-aged woman who had seen the aftermath of the arrest, sat taller under Eleanor's questions. She described what she saw with precision, her fear giving way to strength. When Ethan tried to object again, his voice cracked slightly, and thou, Kitty forced a smirk. Sweat glistened at his temples. Outside the courthouse, protests swelled louder than ever, chants for justice echoing through the streets and seeping through the walls of the courtroom itself. Reporters hustled to capture every word, sensing that this was more than a trial. It was a reckoning. Ethan glanced toward the gallery and caught the gaze of Sarah Matthews, one of his own junior associates. She wasn't watching him with admiration anymore. She was watching Eleanor. Admiration burned in her eyes, the kind Ethan had once craved for himself. Something twisted in his chest, a pang of recognition that respect, the real kind, could never be bullied or bought. But Ethan couldn't stop. Pride would not let him. He pressed on, throwing objection after objection, demanding the judge rein in Eleanor's wandering stories. Each attempt made him look smaller, more desperate. Meanwhile, Eleanor stood calm, unhurried, her words carrying the weight of someone who had lived through storms and outlasted them all. By the time the day's proceedings ended, the tide in the courtroom had shifted completely. The jury leaned toward her. The gallery buzzed with her words. Judge Whitman's eyes lingered on her with something Ethan couldn't place, something that looked like respect, even reverence. As Ethan gathered his papers with shaking hands, he forced a smile for the cameras, but inside he felt the gnawing certainty he couldn't admit aloud. He was no longer the star of this trial. He was no longer the man everyone watched. The woman he had mocked, dismissed, and tried to humiliate was commanding the courtroom in ways he couldn't fathom. And Ethan Marshall, for the first time in his career, began to fear that he wasn't just losing a case, he was losing himself. The final day of testimony dawned with a storm pressing against the courthouse windows, gray skies sagging low over the city, as if nature itself understood that something monumental was about to unfold. Reporters jammed the marble steps outside, their cameras like watchful eyes, their microphones stretching like claws. Inside, the air felt electric, tense, waiting. Everyone knew that today would decide not just the outcome of a case, but the fate of reputations, careers, and legacies. Ethan Marshall arrived earlier than usual, his perfect suit freshly pressed, his tie perfectly knotted. But his reflection in the window of the defense table betrayed him, the bags beneath his eyes, the tightness in his jaw, the faint tremor in his hand. He had been unraveling all week, undone not by a legal argument, but by the quiet presence of an opponent he had dismissed as a relic. Eleanor Washington hadn't raised her voice once, hadn't barked, hadn't sneered, and yet she had commanded every eye in the courtroom. She had tilted the scales without breaking a sweat. Ethan told himself he could still win, that jurors were fickle, that they'd remember his charisma when deliberations began, but doubt gnawed at him like acid. When the court convened, Eleanor walked in with her steady, deliberate stride, Margaret and Lisa Wallace at her side. The gallery erupted in hushed whispers, the protest chants outside echoing faintly through the walls. Ethan sneered to mask his unease. To him, appearances were weapons, and he could not afford to look shaken. The day wore on with closing arguments. Ethan unleashed everything he had left, pacing before the jury, his voice sharp, desperate, gilded with false conviction. He painted Eleanor as outdated, clinging to sentiment. He told the jury this was about law, not sympathy, about facts, not feelings. He pointed to the officers in the gallery as heroes under siege. His words grew louder, his gestures sharper, but the more he thundered, the more obvious his desperation became. When he finally sat down, chest heaving, his forehead glistened with sweat. For the first time in his career, there was no applause in the eyes of the jury, no spark of admiration, only weariness. Then Eleanor rose. She did not carry a stack of notes. She did not strut. She simply stood, her weathered hands resting lightly on the podium. The courtroom fell silent, as if even the walls leaned in to hear her. Her voice came steady, quiet, yet filled with an authority that made every word echo. "We've heard a great deal about law this week," she began. "But law without justice is a tool for the powerful. And law without truth is nothing at all." She looked directly at the jury, her gaze soft yet unyielding. Terrence Wallace was not a name on a file. He was a son, a brother, a man whose life mattered. She didn't lecture. She didn't thunder. She told the jury what justice demanded in simple human terms. "The defense would have you believe that compassion is weakness, but I tell you this, justice without compassion is no justice at all." The room was spellbound. Reporters stopped taking notes. Even the officers in the gallery, some of whom had sat stone-faced all week, shifted uneasily under the weight of her words. And then it happened. Ethan, unable to stand it any longer, snapped. He leapt to his feet, his voice cracking as he shouted, "Your Honor, this is manipulation. She has no credibility. She's nothing but an old woman living on faded memories. What could she possibly know about teaching the law to anyone in this courtroom?" The explosion echoed through the chamber, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. Eleanor didn't flinch. She only looked at him with that same calm, unbroken dignity. It was Judge Whitman who leaned forward, his voice like a blade cutting through the silence. "That will be enough, Mr. Marshall." The young lawyer froze, his breath caught in his tea. Wrote. Judge Whitman's gaze shifted to Eleanor, and for the first time in the trial, his tone carried something different, something almost reverent. "Counselor Washington does not need to prove her credibility to you. She was my mentor. Decades ago, when I was a law student, she taught me what justice means, not the kind written in books, but the kind lived in the world. Every case I've judged, every decision I've made, carries her lessons." The gallery gasped. Jurors leaned forward. Ethan's face drained of color. His knees wobbled beneath the weight of the revelation. "She is not merely an attorney before this court," Judge Whitman continued, his eyes narrowing on Ethan. "She is the reason I am here at all, and if you think mocking her diminishes her, you are gravely mistaken. It diminishes only you." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the storm outside seemed to pause. Ethan's carefully built persona shattered before the eyes of the jury, the gallery, the press. His arrogance, his smirk, his swagger, it all collapsed under the revelation that the woman he had mocked was the very foundation of the man presiding over his fate. Ethan lowered himself back into his chair, his hands trembling, his lips pressed into a thin, defeated line. For the first time, he didn't look like the youngest rising star at the firm. He looked like a child caught cheating, exposed for what he truly was. Eleanor bowed her head slightly in acknowledgement, then returned to her seat. She hadn't raised her voice once, hadn't broken her calm, and yet she had utterly dismantled him. When the jury filed out hours later to deliberate, the city outside was already roaring with chants of justice. Inside, Ethan sat hollow and broken, while Eleanor Washington, the woman he had mocked, radiated the quiet power of someone who didn't just win cases, she changed lives. And in that moment, every person in the at Courtroom understood the truth. Arrogance could command attention for a time, but dignity, real, unshakable dignity, would command history.